Okay, welcome everyone to our regulatory panel. This is our fourth day of the GERPISA PVMI conference, the 30th annual for the GERPISA group. Thank you all for attending. Our attendees have stuck with us for 4 days, our fourth day now. Fifth day, we're going to the Henry Ford and the tour of the F-150 plant. So it's the end of a long week, but we've had some great conversations and great presentations, and we're looking forward to this discussion. Today we have three speakers. We'll start out with Bryant Walker-Smith from University of South Carolina, who specializes in autonomous vehicle, I guess you would call it autonomous vehicle law or regulations. Brian, and welcome. We also have John Bozella from of Innovation. Thank you. And Mike Olishu from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Welcome, Mike. We're going to start out with Brian. Brian, you're going to give us a little overview about what you're up to and the where you see things heading in terms of autonomous vehicle regulations, a little bit of where we've been and where we are right now, and where you see some of the things that need to happen in the near future.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, we could talk about that for hours and hours, although I promise not to.
Know.
You know,
we'll make it part of the discussion.
Yes, what a cool program. Any conference that requires a passport is just darn cool. And I understand a number of the attendees are from overseas. We probably crossed in the air because I am joining you from Bucharest, and I'm delighted to be able to do so. So thank you for the invitation. I'm going to just make a few remarks before we get into the discussion, really focused on the complexity of regulation. And I'll be speaking mostly about the United States, although I'm happy to speak about other countries as well. The US is both unique and at the same time illustrative of the tensions in other countries and regions. And so with respect to the US, it's been said for many years simplistically that the US National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, regulates the design of motor vehicles, whereas US states regulate the operation of motor vehicles. Sorta, maybe. The situation has actually always been much more complex, and I think it will become even more complex. And this increasing regulatory complexity has at least three components. The first is the underlying technologies. Rechargeable batteries, radio transmitters, lasers, right? These are pushing us into new regulatory considerations and even agencies. The second is the applications of those technologies. There are new applications, sidewalk delivery robots that aren't necessarily motor vehicles under federal law, or even flying cars that are both a car or a plane. Again, this shifts us into new regulatory frontiers. And the third aspect of this complexity is new business models for those applications. In particular, a shift from selling cars as products to selling services, selling mobility. And here I don't just mean robotaxis. I also mean telematics and subscription driving services, including potentially subscription automated driving services, the wide range of things that companies are still going to have to do to keep cars moving on roads that they didn't necessarily have to do before. So with these three levels of complexity, right, the changes in underlying technologies, applications of those technologies, and business models for those applications, let's look at a few regulatory levels. The first is the federal government in the US, and get ready for some alphabet soup. So it's not just NHTSA, right? There are other parts of the Department of Transportation, in addition to, as we'll hear from Mike, the Environmental Protection Agency, the National Transportation Safety Board, all play roles directly or indirectly in automotive regulation. Increasingly, I think we're going to see activity by the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, potentially even the Food and Drug Administration. Query for anybody if you can guess why I've included that on the list. Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, as more scrutiny might come to the sources of foreign investment and the uses of US technologies overseas. And all of these will be, I think, an increasingly part of what it means for automobiles to be regulated. In addition, where data finds a home is still kind of unclear. The FTC has been the prominent data regulator for many years at the federal level. NHTSA has been encouraged in the past to get involved to one extent or another and has largely resisted the invitation, but that could change. We might see another agency. We might see, in effect, US states or the European Commission regulating privacy by default, to the extent that the US doesn't have a strong national role. As an aside, for years, I've actually been surprised that the US activities of companies like Baidu and Yandex haven't received more public attention, for better or for worse. We could even see things like that changing. So that's just part of all of the things that the federal government might do as the nature of automobiles change. At the state level, states have always indirectly regulated vehicle design through products liability law. They do vehicle registration, licensing largely, inspections sometimes, regulation of insurance, sort of, consumer protection partially. So this is not just departments of motor vehicles, which have gotten the most attention for automated driving, but also service regulators like California's Public Utilities Commission, which recently approved an application for commercial automated driving services in California, and a vast array of local law enforcement agencies. And so the key here is that design and operation are increasingly overlapping in several ways. Right? The typical concept is that, well, the vehicle is becoming the driver. The automated driving system is the driver, at least in some senses. And so designing a system or vehicle needs to address some of the state rules of the road. Basically, the design has to comply with state law. There are other aspects, though, as well. So ensuring that a system or vehicle is maintained in a safe condition is absolutely essential to ensuring that that system can operate safely. It's not just how a vehicle was designed at the time that it was manufactured, sold, or imported. It's what each unit of that vehicle is still doing and is still capable of doing. Has it been updated? Has it been updated correctly? Should it be updated? Has it not been updated? Is the hardware still functional? Has the hardware been verified? And a lot of this is also part of design, which brings us back to the federal role. For example, a system that is designed to operate even if the vehicle is not in a drivable condition is arguably defective under federal law. Potentially, depending on the analysis, right? An individual vehicle that is hacked is arguably defective for being susceptible to that hack. So there are lots of ways in which the individual artifact of a single vehicle starts merging or overlapping with the design of a make and model. In addition to the federal government and states, we have a wide range of private or quasi-public actors that are going to play an important regulatory role. Electricity providers, electrical grid operators, cellular service providers, standards organizations, even insurers play important quasi-regulatory roles. Florida's regulatory approach for automated vehicles is basically to delegate regulation to insurance companies and by extension the courts. So all of these actors are also important. I want to just touch on the international dimensions as well, which in the US is in some ways less relevant to the regulation of domestic vehicles, but more relevant to the market concerns and the competitive concerns of the country. In other countries, you'll see attention on both of these aspects. So at the UN level, we have a variety of agencies, in particular, World Forum for Harmonization of Vehicle Regulations, which brought us the first global regulation on a particular level 3 automated driving feature, and WP1, the Global Forum for Road Traffic Safety, which is now engaged in an effort to draft a new legal instrument, probably a new treaty on automated driving. And I mention this because it's an opportunity to really think concretely about where international coordination is necessary, whether that coordination takes the form of new binding legal commitments by countries or merely greater coordination or consistency among these countries with respect to their domestic laws. So an example of this, right? Traditionally, the impetus for international cooperation has been when a vehicle or driver based in one country is physically located in another country. This was the basis for a number of treaties in the 20th century, and is still obviously relevant to automated driving. But automated driving makes this more complicated, particularly in combination with telematics and over-the-air updates and the provision of automated driving services and very different national approaches to the regulation of entities and actors involved in automated driving. So now the company or even the individuals providing services such as mapping, remote monitoring and assistance, remote driving, and incident response might be located in another country under the jurisdiction not of the country where the vehicle is driving, but another country altogether. So consider a law enforcement officer or first responder or one authority in one state that comes across a crash, and they might need to quickly, reliably, and credibly ascertain whether that vehicle is under automated operation, identify and contact the company that's facilitating the automated operation of that vehicle, company that might not have a domestic presence, establish to this company that the law enforcement officer or first responder is legitimate and authorized to act. When they give instructions to the companies want to say, well, how do we know you're not spoofing us? How do we know this isn't a call show and you're going to laugh at us? Access information from this company about the vehicle or from the vehicle, even if that information is about other vehicles on the road, and issue instructions to this company. One of the most contested aspects of automated driving, other than whether it should be indicated with a bulb, is the technical, legal, and policy feasibility of instructing a company to stop a vehicle. Could instructions like this have the force of law, even if they transcend national or, for that matter, state boundaries? So I mention these as just examples of the increasing complexity that we're going to face with not just the regulation of technologies, but the regulation of technologies that physically or at least digitally are going to move across national lines. Now, my approach to this regulatory complexity in particular and to regulatory challenges more generally is to focus a lot more on reputation as a regulatory tool and as a regulatory object. So in the US, Congress, or at least the courts, requires the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards test to be objective and repeatable. The key is how the system performs, right? Not how the company performs. I think this will be increasingly untenable and probably untethered from reality, as enforcement activities in particular are going to distinguish between good and bad actors, right? A company that shows itself to be not worthy of trust is, just as a matter of fact, if not law, going to attract more scrutiny than a company that demonstrates itself to be trustworthy. And in this way, trustworthiness is going to play a role in regulation through this instrument of reputation. And in this way, I want to emphasize that, at least in my view, the drivers of automated vehicles, the operators, aren't going to be individuals. They're not going to be owners. They're not going to be hardware and software. They're not going to be no one, right? Driverless car. I think fundamentally companies are going to drive automated vehicles through the services they provide, the increasingly close relationship they have to that operation, through the promises and commitments they make, and through the regulatory obligations that they undertake. This principle that companies drive automated vehicles is at the heart of the model state law on automated driving that was developed by the Uniform Law Commission in the US. Its principles also been embraced by Australia's National Transport Commission, by the UK's law commissions, and the UK Law Commission's recommendations are now being pretty actively pursued by the UK government. So a lot of things are happening right now as we speak. So just in closing, I want to return to what, in my view, it means to be a trustworthy company, since I think that this will and should take on increasing regulatory focus. In my view, a trustworthy company does three things. It shares its safety philosophy, it makes a promise to the public, and then it keeps that promise. What does this mean? Well, the trustworthy company shares its safety philosophy by explaining what it's doing, why it believes what it's doing to be reasonably safe, and why the public can believe it. And I think that we've even seen in the recent release by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration of crash records, the start of this kind of public conversation between companies, regulators, and the public at large. Trustworthy company makes a promise to the public that it markets only what it reasonably believes to be safe, that it will be candid about its limitations and its failures, right? That it will tell a story, not just of what it's accomplished, but what is challenging. And that when it fails, it will make things right. And so a trustworthy company keeps that promise by appropriately managing public expectations, not hyping, not calling something full self-drive that clearly isn't, by supervising the entire product lifecycle. This is in some ways more of an aviation model than an automobile model, and by mitigating harms promptly, fully, and publicly, right? No technology is going to be perfect. Even after technologies fail, companies can still step up and make things right. And I think that's fundamentally why we're talking about a future where it is automated vehicles and a range of advanced automotive technologies that are fundamentally driven by the companies behind them. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, I want to get into that discussion about the international piece of one of the things that we study here at the University of Michigan, and you know that because you presented here at the institute that I used to work at, and it was the connected vehicle, not just the autonomous vehicle, the connected vehicle. And when you get into the story of internationalness, how does that vehicle perform once it's in a different environment? Does it have that connectivity? So we'll talk about that some. Very, very good. Thank you, Brian. John, let's have you go up next. John, you're going to you can speak. I know you can speak about anything related to the automotive industry, but today you're going to focus on one particular area, right?
Well, I'm going to cover two. Can you hear me, Bruce?
We can.
Okay, great. I am going to cover two areas because I'm sharing the stage with both Brian, a safety and AV expert, so I'll cover that, as well as Mike. So I'll cover a little bit in the climate space and the emission space as well. So, but let me say first, Bruce, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here with all of you today, and really to share the panel with two excellent and thoughtful leaders in the regulatory and policy and legal space. So I'm really excited for the conversation today. I just want to, as much as I appreciate being here, I want to pick a fight with you about the title of your conference, The Auto Industry Entering a Post-Pandemic World. And my question to all of you is that a statement or a question?
It doesn't have a question mark at the end of it.
Exactly. But let me tell you, from where I sit, it needs to.
Yeah.
It really is still a question. And so let me just start there by giving you a little bit of perspective about what the U.S. auto industry looks like today. And you've probably heard this from other experts, so I'll be very brief. But the fact of the matter is we are still challenged significantly in the U.S. auto market by the pandemic and its effects. When you look at supply and demand today, the industry is severely supply constrained. And we will produce millions of fewer vehicles than demand would support in the US market this year. Inventories on dealer lots are at historic lows. This time in 2019, there were probably 3 million units landed on dealer lots across the country. Now there are probably fewer than 1 million. And so what you really see here is the result of massive supply chain challenges, and primarily in the microprocessor shortage space. We continue to be challenged by this. We will be challenged by this through 2022 and well into 2023, in my view, based on data that I've seen and conversations that we've had with our member companies. And so, again, not to pick a real fight, but there still is a question as to whether, from an automotive industry perspective, we're really through the pandemic. Let me just say, just a little bit about who we are. We represent the auto industry broadly. We represent about 98% of new vehicle sales in the United States. I will call them trustworthy companies because I like Brian's frame. So what you see here is major automotive manufacturers, as well as tier one suppliers and tech companies and automated self-driving software companies, chipset manufacturers. So we represent the industry broadly. Not only what it is today, but where it's going, hardware and software, mobility and manufacturing. And why that's important is because of what Brian talked about. If you think about it, that alphabet soup he took you through, that's my job, is managing that alphabet soup. We operate at the intersection of automotive innovation and public policy. So that's just a little bit of perspective for you. I want to just very quickly touch on this idea that nations that lead the development and adoption of innovative technologies are going to shape supply chains, define the global standards and running rules, and really reshape the international marketplace. We represent global players. I also personally, in addition to running the US-based association, I also have a role running the Global Association of Auto Manufacturing Associations around the world. And I can tell you that competitiveness is driving discussions around standards and around challenges and around this transformation. I don't have to explain to this audience how significant this transformation is. We are really finishing a 50-year cycle in the automotive industry and entering a new 50-year cycle with electrification, automation, connectivity, new models of use of mobility and ownership. And so the regulatory environment is really going to have a significant impact on the pace of this transformation, as well as who the winners and losers are, both regionally as well as in the private sector. Let me start with electrification. There is no question in my mind that the future is electric. The question is, how fast do we get there? And again, regionally, what happens? This is a quick snapshot for those of you who are visiting from other places around the world about what the sort of development landscape looks like for EVs and EV components here in the United States. You're going to see $91.8 billion of US investment by 2025. That's a part of a global investment of $515 billion across the industry broadly. By 2025, today there are 78 electrified models in the marketplace. And by electrified, I mean battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. That number by 2026 will probably be about 130 models. What you're seeing is the development in the United States of battery plant manufacturing, significant capacity expansion to meet very audacious goals that both the industry and regulators have for this sector and for electrification going forward, which I'll touch on in a second. But what you can see here is significant investment across the United States. What's it going to take to really expand and accelerate EV adoption? Really, there are four keys to success here. One is cost. EVs still are more expensive than internal combustion engine issues, so we have to continue to address cost, but also the cost of the fuel, quote unquote. Production is very significant. We are doing nothing short than retooling and reimagining the entire automotive industrial base. That is what we're doing. So everything, factories, labor, how we think about the supply chain from the mine mouth through the end of the useful life of the battery pack and then around again in a circular economy is going to be what this is all about on the production side. From a consumer perspective, frankly, you could start there. Awareness, choice, capability, convenience. Right now in the United States, here's a fun fact to know and trade. The average transaction price for an electric vehicle is in the $65,000 range. So that's extraordinary, right? So what's happening? The purchasers of electric vehicles today are people like me. I drive an electric vehicle. I can park it in my garage. I can charge it at home, which is what 80% of people do today. But in order for us to get from the 5% roughly we're at today to the 15% and the 25%, the 50%, and ultimately the 100% that we want to get to, we've got to expand our offerings, reduce prices, and make sure that we are creating availability across the economy and across the American landscape, which brings me to infrastructure. Still, the number one question in the research we do is, where do I charge this thing? That's still today the question. So infrastructure is incredibly important. And what you can see here as you look at this, and this is true not only in the United States, but in markets all around the world, to get these conditions right, it's going to take a partnership, which I'll get into in a second. I'm going to jump ahead of Mike and steal some of his thunder, and he's going to correct my work. But let me just give you a little bit of perspective on the regulatory backdrop. I'm going to start with the California Air Resources Board, because they are in the process right now as we speak of approving the most transformative regulation in the history of the automotive industry, certainly in the United States. And this is not an overstatement. We are now on a path to 100% EV sales in a third or more of the US market by 2035. The interim target, just to pick one, is that number is about 68% of EV sales, again, in 35% of the US market, meaning California and states that follow California's rules, by 2030. Again, we're at 5% right now. So this is a dramatic shift that's going to change the way we consume transportation and the way we build cars and trucks here in the United States and frankly across the world. What's Mike doing? I'm going to, again, apologies in advance, Mike. What's clearly happening here also is President Biden has laid out an executive order last year with a goal of 50% EV sales by 2030. This is an audacious goal in and of itself across the United States. And there's clearly a rulemaking process, which hopefully Mike will give us a little bit of an insight into, that we need to be engaged and working with Mike and his team, as well as the California Air Resources Board on as we go forward. Very audacious, challenging goals. We are, as an industry, working hard to meet them. The question is, can we get there? I'm old enough to remember all of the feasibility conversations we had with regulators over the years, the 25 years or so I've been in this industry. And over the past 24 and a half of those years, feasibility meant the following: how much technology at what cost goes into the vehicle by what time? And that's what the model spits out. Going forward, from model years, say 26 on, feasibility will now be defined outside the vehicle. Feasibility is going to be about fueling and infrastructure. Feasibility is going to be about the availability of raw materials and whether we have resilient supply chains that support American manufacturing. And feasibility is going to be about overall market readiness. Can we satisfy customers' needs at all price points and in every region of our vast country? That is the definition of feasibility going forward. And that is bigger than one company and frankly, bigger than one industry. And so that's where we're going. Let me just touch a little bit on some of the areas Brian talked about. And I agree with a lot of what he said, by the way, so I'm looking forward to the conversation. Unlike the environment and energy space, we have a different problem with AV testing and deployment, which is we do not have a national regulatory framework or a policy framework, and we need to have one. And so we're working in a number of areas. We do need, while we're working through what the future federal motor vehicle safety standards look like in the United States, we need to create near-term pathways for testing and deployment on public roads at scale. Why? The agency needs the data to develop those new standards. And we need to demonstrate as an industry and to the public through NHTSA, the stand-in for the public, that we're committed to safety in everything we do, and that the work we're doing through these pathways demonstrates that we're producing as safe or safer vehicles in this space. We also need to, and Brian touched on this a little bit, so I'll be brief, we do need to focus on the benefits. We jump right into the technology aspects of it, but what are we talking about here? We're talking about technology that has great promise to save lives on America's roadways, which we absolutely have to do. We're talking about technology that creates greater access to personal mobility for people who don't currently enjoy it. We have the opportunity to investigate and prove out fleet emissions benefits from highly automated vehicle technologies. And so we have a lot of work to do there. And frankly, there's a bit of an anti-AV narrative in the space, certainly from investment analysts who I think bought into hype. And now we're like, where are all these AVs? And so we have our work to do. We need to continue to focus on the benefits and making sure that we have those pathways laid out. I want to touch quickly on clear distinctions between driver assistance systems and automated driving systems. These are two very different things. And unfortunately, as Brian talked about, there is some conflation, some of it in the marketplace. And frankly, that's inappropriate and wrong. And some of it by people in the policy space who frankly ought to know better. And so we do need to make sure that what we're talking about when we talk about driver assistance systems is systems that, and by the way, this is what's on the road today. There is not a car in commerce today where you cannot be attentive to the driving task 100% of the time. Sorry, that's the case. And if companies are suggesting otherwise, that's a problem. We've laid out a set of principles about that. And we also support, for example, the monitoring of drivers who are operating these driver assistance systems to make sure that we have technology and support to keep the drivers attentive. And then lastly, there are significant broader societal concerns that we need to address. What is the impact on the workforce? Well, I'm happy to say in the near term, it's overwhelmingly positive. We're creating massive employment opportunities for engineers and software developers. But what will the workforce impact be for automation down the line? We need to look at that, investigate it, talk about it. How do we think about liability? How do we think about equity? Those types of things. So we're working on all of those things. And so let me just sum up by saying we need to get there together. Industry is leading the transformation, but we need a national strategy. And that will come through engaged partnerships with our public sector policymaking colleagues, as well as other sectors along the economy. So we're looking forward to doing that and to the conversation.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, Mike.
Hey, Bruce, I'll just jump right in as soon as I can figure out what screen I want to share here. So good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for this opportunity to meet this morning. My name is Mike Alachu. I'm the director of the Light Duty Vehicle and Small Engine Center at the US EPA. The presentation I'm going to give is more surrounded about what EPA has been up to in this space. John provided, you did steal a little bit of my thunder, John, and I'm not sure that my goals or the EPA's goals are audacious or not, but maybe we could all judge that by the time I'm done here. So about where I'm from, and then recap some of the recent regulatory activities. So first off is the National Vehicle Fuel and Emissions Laboratory, which is right across the street, actually, from where you all are meeting today in Ann Arbor. I was hoping to walk over this morning, but COVID had its own ideas on what my plans were for today. This the NVFEL is a very, very capable and state-of-the-art laboratory. It is, as a regulator, I'm very lucky to be able to work in this space because it provides all of the resources that we need to do our job. We do testing there for both certification and compliance and confirmatory testing. We do testing on for powertrain development. And so while we still do contract work with third-party suppliers, we find that much of the work we can do physically right at the Ann Arbor lab. A couple other important takeaways on this is that we regulate all mobile sources out of this facility. So that includes everything from handheld line trimmers, which I am responsible for, to ocean-going vessels, large aircraft, and locomotive. So the entire breadth of mobile sources and the fuels that power them. So we recently finalized a rulemaking that impacted the 2023 to 2026 model year vehicles. The slide basically summarizes where we landed in that rulemaking process. So on the graph on the left, the dotted top line is the safe rulemaking as it's typically known, and those were the standards that were finalized under the previous administration. We looked at several alternatives in this space and landed on going even farther than the 2012 FRM standards that were finalized under the Obama standards. So you can see the dark or the sort of gray dashed line was the 2012 FRM. Getting some stuff going on my computer here. That's not helpful. The sort of gray dashed line is the 2012 FRM, which was finalized under the Obama administration. The darker dashed line was our proposal, and the dark black line is our finalized standard. So we finalized what is basically the most stringent greenhouse gas standards that we've ever had in this country going out to 2026 model year. And we strongly believe that this is an excellent jumping off point for 2027 plus in the transition to a zero emission fleet. So just a recap of the benefits of this rule, there are significant benefits associated with these new standards. At a 3% discount rate, it's $190 billion. At 7%, it's $120 billion. We project that to meet those standards in 2026 model year, that there will be as many as 17% EVs being sold to support the standards, 3.1 billion tons of CO2 avoided, gasoline consumption reduced by 360 billion gallons, and a lifetime fuel savings cost of over $1,000. So then this will start, I think, some of the thunder that John was starting to steal, but that's okay. It's good to see some harmony between the presentations. So as John pointed out, Executive Order 14037 has directed the agencies to implement, to set new standards for motor vehicles. And that executive order included both light duty and medium duty vehicles in this space, which we think there's some advantages to. It's a multi-pollutant rulemaking. In other words, we will set both greenhouse gas and criteria pollutant standards. And the executive order states to go out to at least model year 2030. We're not sure exactly how far the rulemaking will go out. That is most certainly a decision that the administrator will make in this process. We are, of course, as John mentioned, very much looking forward to engaging with all stakeholders in this process. It is very interesting to hear the thoughts around what feasibility looked like in this space, and that is absolutely the responsibility of I and my staff, is to be able to produce that technical analysis that the administrator will rely on to make a decision about what the most appropriate standards are for these vehicles. John already recapped the timing. So we've been communicating too much with the Alliance, I see. I think we need to, so we need to hold some of this back so we actually have some original material. So, and then I just want to talk a little bit about what this means, because this being an international forum, the terms light duty vehicles and medium duty vehicles might not have a lot of meaning, especially given the size of some of our vehicles. And these pictures might actually be a little bit shocking for some of the attendees to see exactly what these vehicles mean. So light duty vehicles means everything from a Toyota Corolla all the way up through a light duty pickup truck. So that would be like an F-150 or a Chevy Silverado. And then the medium duty space, I should say that we also have a specific category called medium duty passenger vehicle, which is that Chevy Suburban that's shown in the sort of also in the tan box. And then in the medium duty space, those are our 3/4 ton pickup trucks and 1 ton pickup trucks and cargo vans. And the interesting thing about this sort of space being a continuum in this regulatory environment is that we are worried that as the light duty vehicles, those vehicles to the left, are electrified, we may see some consumers start to bleed over into that 2B and 3 market, those 3/4 ton and 1 ton market, and they would be in fact purchasing even more capability than they need right now. And so we're going to look very closely at sort of the continuum of the standards between the light duty and the medium duty market, and make sure that we don't create a discontinuity there that favors a lot of people moving into that space. So that was pretty much short and sweet. That is my last slide, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to start out with the question that I've been asked. I've been talking about with our colleagues over the last week while we've been here, and it has to do with the kind of the feasibility story that John was talking about. I guess, Mike, it might go to you, but it could be answered by John or Brian. You guys can chime in. When they look at the feasibility story of the introduction of electric vehicles and where the challenges that are needed for it to come to fruition and to be mass marketed, right? It's not only a technological change, it's a social change where you've got a lot of social pressures and issues that are related to this kind of transformation because it is so dramatic. Mike, how do you guys deal with the kind of the social adjustments that consumers, homeowners, other agencies in the states have to manage when they're going through the transition?
That's a good question. So it's interesting because in the past, as John pointed out, he's been in this business for a long time, that feasibility, for us used to mean that if you could do it on one vehicle, if one vehicle manufacturer could do it, if you could put a 3-way catalyst on a vehicle, that sort of was enough. That sort of burden was enough to be able to say that, okay, we could apply that. There's no reason why there's no barriers for why that technology couldn't be applied broadly. And even in looking at things today, I mean, electric vehicles are feasible, right? I mean, there are plenty of examples of electric vehicles. So it's not a matter of whether the technology is actually capable of being built and in mass quantities distributed, whether people are willing to buy them. But the social aspects of it, this the way we look at it internally is as a number of sort of parities, right? A lot of people talk about cost parity in the EV market, right? But that parity is only one of several parities. Performance parity, capability parity, and also like familiarity, the social aspects of it. How familiar are people with the actual product? And I can say that it is a very difficult thing to try to quantify. I think one of the things that we're going to try to do here is, as of course, model availability, and I think John touched on that also. That helps with acceptability. If people don't feel like they need to move out of their current product, maybe that's a crossover CUV. If they have a number of crossover CUVs that are electrified, I think that type of situation will help with the familiarity and the feasibility of it. As far as charging goes, that's going to be a little bit more interesting, because I think that's going to take people having experience with it, having experience with the technology to sort of move those like social aspects of it, to understand that sometimes I laugh, as Americans, we probably worry too much about our next meal. And I think that EV drivers, we're going to need to not worry so much about our next meal. We're going to be able to get our next meal. It's going to happen. So.
Yeah, it really is, especially from an EPA perspective. It's much more of a bigger issue when you're looking at the environment. right? And you're looking at the environment over the long term, and you're trying to take a long-term perspective of what needs to be done to protect the environment. John, when you listen to this story, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I think Mike said it very well. And I loved his perspective on different types of parity, right? Cost parity, convenience parity, for example. Those are great, ways to think about the social dynamics that you're talking about. I would add one thing, because I agree with what Mike said, so I won't repeat it. There's also, you talked about the climate imperative, the emissions reduction goals with regard to EVs. I think there's also a national security and an economic security imperative, which, raises some of the social change questions that you're talking about. For example, are EVs good for American workers? Right? Are EVs, in other words, do we have sufficiently robust supply chains? And can we, if not mine raw materials here, which we should be able to do, and we need to be able to do, can we capture the value of materials that we process here, that we use here, that we can then recycle here and then reuse? I mean, those are big social questions too, because look, I come from Washington, and I'm here to help. The thing about the debate in Washington right now is this question: are we, are EVs, or is our shift to EVs going to benefit other nations more with regard to economic and national security than it's going to benefit the United States? If we do this right, if we make this transformation right, and we have thoughtful policy support for the transformation that we're talking about, it will be a winning proposition for the American economy, for the American worker. But we have work to do to get there. So that's a social consideration.
John, when you look at the issues for supporting the industry in making the transition, and consumers as well, helping them make the transition, what do you see as some of the key points that you guys would like, maybe that are not even in place yet, but you would like to see?
Yeah, I come back to these ideas about feasibility. I do think we have to, as we work, Mike's got a hard job, and sort of setting this course for the future, is going to be very challenging. And I do think, and this is what I was trying to touch on before, I do think we have to figure out how to agree on the key yardsticks, because the vehicle technology is there. So the question is, what are the appropriate waypoints? How much infrastructure? Or do we have vehicle volumes that are ahead of infrastructure development? What are we looking at? What's the metric? Is it, chargers per vehicle or vehicles per charger? How much public charging? How much level 3 public charging? We should agree as a country, or even more broadly, about what those waypoints are, what those metrics, how much availability, and frankly, we're talking about not only cost of raw materials, but its availability. And so we ought to have, to me, metrics. That's the macro thing. With regard to the micro, yeah, it's about convenience, meaning charging availability. Here's an interesting survey we've done. People who see public charging believe EVs are ready for prime time. People who live in communities that never see chargers, they think it's some sort of science project or some sort of future endeavor. So we do, at a micro level, need to build awareness about vehicles. We're working, with other sectors of the economy on that. So that's how I would look at it, both micro and macro.
Very good. Brian, we've been talking about EVs, but AVs have a lot of regulatory issues that you mentioned very clearly in your presentation. How do you see those things getting overcome?
Yeah, so I think EVs and AVs present different questions at this point, in part for the reason of technological availability that John and Mike alluded to. I will say on EVs, I'm sorry that I disagree so much. I agree so much with both of you, excuse me. Really one of the questions is do you push EVs as get people to buy EVs, or do you push it as people are buying vehicles, and EVs are vehicles and they're just normal? And I think that's one of the real contributions of CARB in California. Just normalize EVs. John mentioned the availability of charging. That goes to normalization. The used car market is, I think, a real opportunity, in some ways, a challenge to normalize these systems. When we think about AVs, a lot of what we learn from EVs can inform AVs, which are years behind both the technological timeframe and the hype timeframe. And so, what we learn about used EVs at this point, for example, would be wonderful in thinking about how we might eventually retrofit hundreds of millions of existing vehicles with more advanced safety or even assistance, or ultimately automated driving technologies. When we talk about the regulation of AVs, I first want to emphasize that for, gosh, a decade, I have been listening to people say, well, the technology is ready. It's just these darn lawyers who are in the way. The regulators won't put out rules, or the lawyers are going to sue. And so that's why we don't have nice, shiny automated vehicles. And the reality is that the technologies haven't gotten to the point where they are demonstrably reliable across a wide range of circumstances. And that is still the key driver for, I think, these technologies and their adoption and their regulation. John had mentioned the need for a nationwide short-term and really long-term strategy, both for a legal environment for deployment and a much broader policy environment for thinking about the impacts and the opportunities of these technologies. And I'd echo both of those. There is, I think, sometimes a knee-jerk reaction to say, well, we got to do something, and that something has to be legislation, and forget the substance, for the content, we just have to pass it. And that's not the level of nuance we need in this. So, for example, NHTSA actually has all the tools it needs to support the long-term mass deployment of automated vehicles, and that's through development of a federal motor vehicle safety standard or amendment of the existing standards to accommodate automated vehicles. NHTSA could accomplish this in other ways too. I think their interpretation of some of the existing standards might be overly stringent and could be amenable to more flexibility that would deliver that flexibility more short-term. I think what John was referring to with wide-scale deployments is a legislative restriction that prevents NHTSA from exempting a large number of vehicles from NHTSA's own standards. And that would be something that would have to be addressed legislatively. It's been interesting to me how the appetite for legislation has kind of waxed and waned, depending on what's in it and depending on what group is particularly interested. And it may be that the symbolic value of legislation is valuable. That being able to say, look, yes, Germany passed something. Yes, the UK is passing things. All right, we've done it too. Don't worry, we've passed it. I'd like to think that we can go beyond that though and think, well, what are our goals? And in what ways can automation technologies serve those goals? In what ways do automated technologies need to be managed so that they do not interfere with those goals? And to have that kind of higher level approach, whether it's at the legislative domain or the regulatory executive domain. How was that for a start, Bruce?
We're getting there. We're getting there. I think we could have this conversation for the rest of the day. But when I listen to all of you speak, and I can't help but think that there's this political story behind all of this that makes it. And when you start talking about legislative stuff, you're talking about political decisions that have to be made. And if you had a country where 75% or 85% of the people tended to agree, yes, we want to move in this kind of direction. And we see climate change as a serious thing, and we want to move in this direction, and we're supporting it of this. But when you don't have that, and when you don't have legislators that do not support it, it really slows down the process. So, and I know the manufacturers always struggle with this because they go from one administration to another, and sometimes they're getting whiplash. Of course, EPA gets whiplashed as well because they have different administrators that are going back and forth, not inside EPA, but at least at the head of EPA, right? And so it becomes a real challenge to, we say that democracy is a slow process, right? And in some ways it plays out in what we're doing here. I want to get our audience involved a bit with questions. We're going to have you come up and ask questions. So if you have questions for these folks, and I know you do, please come on up. This is Marika Stevens. She's from Erasmus University in the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. And that explains a lot because we're the size of Maryland and we don't have range anxiety. But I wonder, in most of your stories, is there a role for the consumer? Because in Netherlands, we're moving to a system where a dealer gets a CO2 budget. And so if they sell an SUV, they have to sell a couple of small vehicles afterwards. And also me as an employee of a public university, I get a CO2 budget for my research. Like how often do I need to go to the US to understand mobility issues? So we're really putting a lot of responsibility at the individual level. And you said legislators and the people in the US maybe not ready for that. We do have a legislator that's ready for that. But I wonder if there's any of these thoughts in your minds at this point. Thanks.
Mike,
do you want to go first? Well, I have some thoughts, but why don't you go ahead?
I'm sure you do. So yeah, we've been really thinking a lot about the role of consumers in this process. When we finalized our 2009 and 2012 rules, the standards were constructed as a footprint curve, and those footprint curves were designed to basically to preserve consumer choice. So larger vehicles with more capability, trucks versus cars had higher CO2 targets. And so basically what that meant is that the vehicle manufacturers could reasonably sell whatever the customers wanted to buy, and that there would be a compliance scenario. And it worked as intended from a consumer choice standpoint. It actually worked a little too well, actually, because what ended up happening is, and what we did not anticipate was that very many people started to choose trucks over cars. And in the United States, we had a very large shift from cars to trucks. And what we projected as being, certain environmental benefits going out to 2025 started to degrade. In 2017, we had degraded by 7 grams per mile. By 2019, 2020, we had degraded by 17 grams per mile. As far as so that consumer choice that was built into the standards really did impact our ability to realize our environmental benefits. And so, yes, so now as we think about the 2027 plus rulemaking going beyond, we're trying to figure out how do we create a more robust program to be able to ensure that we're getting the environmental benefits that we're anticipating, the environmental benefits that we're going to tell the American public that we're going to get out of this program. And one of those certainly is the activity surrounding the vehicles. I mean, how do people choose which vehicles? It's not only which vehicles people choose to buy, but also how those vehicles are operated on the road. And those could be, that could be addressed through test procedure changes. It could be addressed obviously through the standards, any number of means. But we certainly recognize that consumer choice has a big impact on our projected environmental goals.
Yeah, I think that in the first rule that you were talking about, it was 2008, 2009, or around that time, they were predicting something like 50% passenger car, 50% light truck, and ended up being 70% light truck, 30% passenger car, which completely screwed up the estimates, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, but let's tell the whole story, right? Because the fuel price estimate was over $1 wrong in those same estimates. And so
we got that now, John.
We had the fuel price too high, and the vehicle mix in the United States is directly related to the price of fuel. Like, so if you chart those two lines, they run together. So now I do agree with Mike's point about footprints, right? What you saw is improvements across the model range while still providing that choice? It's an interesting question for the regulator, and I'm not going to debate that with Mike now. I want to come back to, sort of the questioner's point about, well, like what else can we be doing? We don't in the United States have an economy-wide carbon plan. We don't do that, right? What we're doing is we're regulating by sector. And so there's something missing there. The other thing I would point out is that there is an opportunity through policy to support this shift through consumer incentives. And that seems to be the way we're doing it here in the United States at the state level, where we're providing through a tax credit, an income tax credit, or sometimes a grant to a consumer to favor an EV purchase over an ICE purchase. This is an incredibly important policy tool that needs to be used, continued, and expanded at the federal level and at the state level. Right now, there's a federal tax credit that's valued at $7,500 for the purchase of a BEV or a plug-in hybrid or a hydrogen fuel cell. It has a manufacturer volume cap associated with it, and some of the biggest players in the EV market can no longer provide consumers with that tax credit. That needs to be reinstituted. And you're thinking, wait a minute, there's waiting lists for these cars. Yeah, at 4%. The fact of the matter is there's waiting lists for every car in the marketplace today because there's no chips. There's no, so put that aside. The fact of the matter is we need to continue to stimulate demand in this country. And those tax credits and those incentives are a critical tool for policymakers to use.
John, I think it's also and I think Mike mentioned this as well, the issue of once there are more different types of vehicles available, then I think you get a better chance of really measuring consumer response. Because very few compact SUVs, which is the biggest selling segment in the world, but they're coming. They're coming. So it's really and it's, I think, a rather short term. It'll be that we'll start seeing those. Ryan, did you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge that you're alluding to is that individuals participate largely through economics, through cost, and so it's a very awkward time to be sitting here and saying, well, driving needs to cost more, and so then the answer is say, well, some forms of driving need to cost less. The challenge there is will those benefits be delivered in a way that is equitable or across society, or will those ultimately accrue to the higher income purchasers who can already afford to buy a new vehicle, which is just a slice of the population. And so these are, as you said, Bruce, very political, very difficult questions, because basically what we're talking about is influencing choice through cost, while trying to ensure that equity is and remains a part of the conversation.
Very good, thank you. Next question.
Great summary, Brian.
Our next question comes from Tommaso Pardi. He's the director of the GERPISA program that's sponsoring this conference.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the great presentations. I have two questions. The first question is about carbon neutrality in 2050. If I'm not wrong, the Biden administration has committed to that. The European Union has done the same. The European Union has come to the conclusion that if you want carbon neutrality in the transport sector, since light vehicles last at least 15 years, you need to stop selling internal combustion engine cars by 2035. And now this is becoming a law. And frankly, if somebody has told the automotive industry 3 years ago that that would happen, they would have believed it. So we see this acceleration in Europe towards carbon neutrality, which means that we will have perhaps 100% battery electric vehicle markets by 2030, because of course, car manufacturers will stop developing internal combustion engine technology if they know that the technology is dead in 2035. So what this European trajectory means for US regulations is going to set a precedent, is going to put a challenge in terms of feasibility. What do you think about this European decision? Do you think it's wise, unwise, crazy? So that would be my first question. The second question is about autonomous vehicles. So that was a great presentation about the future challenge. But what, as we have heard about the accidents in testing of Uber, we knew about the autopilot accident. What has been the impact of that in terms of thinking about the regulation and feasibility of the AV technology? Because like 3 years ago in Paris, we had the former CEO of Renault, Luis Vetzerda, made a big speech about autonomous vehicle and said, the biggest challenge is that, of course, autonomous vehicle will reduce casualties, but the trust of people in this technology is that it must reduce casualties not by 10, not by 1,000 times, but almost by reducing casualties to nothing. Otherwise, just a single people killed will kill the technology because it will kill the reputation and the trust of the technology. So what's your thinking about what has been happening and the impact of the Ubers and Tesla accidents? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tommaso. Mike, let's start with you on, is it crazy?
No, it's I would never say it's crazy. So there, so these types of events, whether they're happening in Europe or California or Canada, they are very important. I think they demonstrate not only the commitments of individual countries, but also the fact that each one of these countries is looking at the technology very seriously and believing that in the light duty space that they can get there. So in our world and at EPA, it is helpful to be able to point towards those activities and to be able to show our leadership that other countries are going in the same direction, right? I mean, John might think about that as just being sort of momentum and maybe not necessarily in a good way, but it also increases the burden of our responsibility on the technical analysis side, because now it's not so much that we need to just be able to be cognizant of like the critical minerals that need to go into the United States and what quantity of EVs could be supported here. We also need to be thinking about, well, if Europe's going 100%, Canada's going 100%, and California, the Section 177 states are going 100%. So how does that impact the overall availability of minerals and manufacturing capacity to be able to support the incremental federal program? Because that is my job, right? To be able to determine the feasibility of that increment. So, and we can't be blind to the fact that all of these other activities are going on at the same time. So while I think it's advantageous for us to be able to look to those countries and be able to point at them, and it is also increases the burden a bit to be able to demonstrate feasibility.
Yeah, I mean, Bruce, can I just build on that?
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so I'm not going to characterize the rules, but I think that's what I was trying to say earlier. California has already set the course to zero emissions, or to 100 in their terminology, 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035. So yes, that is the regulatory course. The questions are really outside the vehicle. And what not only regulators like Mike have to think about, but we have to think about as a society broadly, and from a policy perspective more broadly, is, are the conditions that are necessary to make that market a reality, do they exist? Do we have the availability of raw materials? Right now, the answer in the United States is no. Do we have sufficient infrastructure? Right now, the answer in the United States is no. And so that doesn't mean we're not going to get there. But what it means is we have to have a national strategy that gets beyond the vehicle, beyond the four wheels of the vehicle. And that talks about grid resiliency, that talks about the renewables on the grid, because frankly, EVs are elsewhere emitting vehicles. And so we've got to clean the grid, right? The grid has to be resilient and accept much greater demand than we're pulling from it today. And if you've ever been to California in the summer or Texas in the winter, you know we're not there yet. And so we have a lot of work to do as a society to get to that reality. And so that's the work we're on, right? So technology leadership, yes. Industry leadership, yes. Partnership with our public sector policymakers and other sectors of the economy is what's required to answer Tomas's question.
Very good. Thank you, John. Brian, you got the AV question?
So I think the question was about the role of crashes. These are crashes of test automated driving systems and crashes involving advanced driver assistance systems. and the role that the public attention to those crashes has played in policy conversations, in market conversations, in general, just public appetites. And I think we can distinguish between the policy level discussions and the public sentiment. So first, at a policy level, I do think some of the crashes have been pretty instrumental. So there were a lot of reasons for why the AV bills at the federal level stalled around the same time as Uber's notorious fatal Arizona crash. One of those reasons is actually related to the emissions questions that we've been talking about. But another one of those reasons, I think, really was at the same time a loss of trust in the technologies, in some of the companies, and even in the regulators at the time under the previous administration. And given that total lack of trust by some of the key senators, there was just enough of a delay for a lot of other concerns to independently delay that bill. And so there is a causal story there to be told, not a complete one, but a partial one. For the public has a 5-second attention span. Maybe 6 seconds when robots kill people. But sadly, just so much of the conversation is based on incorrect headlines, based on largely incorrect articles, based on incorrect press releases, that it's too convoluted, I think, to even be all that concerned about the relationship between distinct incidents and how willing the public will be to accept AVs at the point that they are widely deployed or available.
Can I just want to if I can just build on what Brian said for a second. I'm going to quarrel with you slightly. The Senate bill did not fail because of a lack of trust in the technology on the part of certain senators. It failed because the legislative process allows for stakeholders to come in and ask for things unrelated to AV technology, and that's what happened. And so that bill was held hostage by other vested interests that had nothing whatsoever to do with safety or AV technology, number one. Number two, I think Tomas's question is really important because one of the things he asked was the impact of Tesla crashes. Teslas are not AVs. They are not automated vehicles. They are not highly automated vehicles. They are ADAS vehicles. Those vehicles require an attentive driver 100% of the time. So that's why those vehicle crashes are impactful, because they're not automated vehicles. And so the data set that we're looking at now, we don't have enough context to draw any conclusions, but it's really important to recognize that those are not AVs.
And it's very interesting to see the progression of AVs. We've seen now we've seen the Waymo vehicle now come to San Francisco, and we know that we said the Cruise automation, which is the GM automated vehicle, is now cruising the streets of San Francisco, albeit from 10 p.m. until 6 a.m. only. But it shows you that there is some progress that's being made here. And by doing anything in San Francisco, driving anywhere in San Francisco and doing it safely is a challenge. Not because there's some bad drivers, it's just the terrain. It's just crazy there. Hey, we have John Paul McDuffie from PVMI, one of our sponsors for the conference. He has a question.
Hello, thank you, everybody. Great presentations. So I have a question about auto insurance, and let's just stipulate that a functioning auto insurance system is valuable to the society, and figuring out how to keep that. We're not going to automatically, magically enter the world of 100% AVs that are 100% safe. So we'll have accidents. So, the federal government establishes the safety of the vehicles when they're sold, and the states regulate the drivers, and the states regulate that the cars are inspected. That's the rules that we have so far. And the insurance companies underwrite the individual drivers by their characteristics. Okay, so when you don't have an individual driver, you have an algorithm, then it's companies driving the cars, as Brian said. And, you know, some people say that means the product liability takes the place of our old system. But I've had some opportunities to talk to some insurance industry executives, and they're actually pretty confident that they could figure out a way to underwrite AV trips, but they would need a bunch of data that they don't currently have access to. And their view is they're not sure that the companies that have the data, whether it's the OEMs that make the vehicles or possibly the companies that control the operating systems, will give them the data, because the data are incredibly valuable, even the subset of data that they would need, or would make them pay for the data, which would then, in their views, make the insurance system unaffordable. So there's a kind of argument that there would be a public good in mandating some sharing of the information that would be necessary to support the auto insurance system for the AV era. And I wonder what you think about that, both whether that's a correct, you know, diagnosis, and is it feasible to get there politically, or with all the complex negotiations involved among the parties.
Thank you.
John, you got a piece of that from when they start talking about the manufacturer being driving the car, right? Before we get Brian's take on that, I want to hear yours.
Yeah, so I agree with part of the diagnosis, and I'm not sure about another part of it. I certainly agree that you know, this insurance question is an important one, and I also agree that it will be worked out. Right. I mean, you know, right now, when we think about auto insurance in the, you know, personal mobility context, we think about B2C, right? We think about business to consumer auto insurance. As Brian said, you know, the future of a highly automated vehicles is likely to be a fleet future. I would agree with that assessment. And so I think you can see the insurance model go from B2C, business to consumer, to B2B, business to business. And large fleets might self-insure, and smaller fleets might buy insurance products from insurance companies. So I do think that it isn't an overwhelmingly challenging problem, that the market will work itself out. The question of data is a much more challenging question. And I think we don't know enough yet to know how that's going to work itself out. You know, I can appreciate an insurance company that would say, I make money by underwriting policies, and I would like the data that underwrites my business to be free to me. I would love all of my costs of goods sold to be free to me too. So I don't know if it's going to work out that way, where the cost of goods sold, quote unquote, for the insurance companies will come free to them or not, or how they will get sufficient data if they don't have sufficient data. That's a big question. But I also think the marketplace will largely work itself out in that regard as well. And what you're seeing is partnerships right now between automakers and insurance companies, for example, that do include, I'm guessing, I'm not privy to those contracts, but, you know, would include, I would imagine, some sharing of data.
Hey, Brian.
Gosh, I so appreciated the last time when John and I were on the verge of really disagreeing, and you stepped in, Bruce, and now I have to go back to agreeing with him, and that's no fun. Largely. So it was a really good question about insurance and about data access. And I'll note that the insurance industry has actually given us some of the best insights into the performance of various ADAS features that are on vehicles today, because the insurance industry is so attuned to the financial costs of crashes, which is distinct, which is not the same as societal cost, but can in some ways be used as a bit of a proxy. I would also distinguish, as John did, between consumer-facing automotive insurance and automotive and insurance more broadly. And the largest companies are going to figure out, I think, a way to both stay active in consumer-facing insurance. They're not going to withdraw and say, "Oh, we're not going to defend this AV," because they want to be involved. They want to be involved in processing claims and being the person that their customers call. And at the same time, in developing these new models and markets to serve businesses directly, as John said, or can serve consumers indirectly through more service-based models. The data access, there is a role for public data, Yesterday's release of data by NHTSA was an important step. I agree with John that it tells us very little, right? It tells us very little about differences between various ADAS. It also tells us nothing about the differences between vehicles with these features and vehicles without these features. We're just missing important denominators. And we're missing consistency in reporting mode and reporting content. And so there's not a lot we can say. And that kind of consistent reporting could be really important. And there are economic incentives for that to happen. So I think the insurance industry, which is surprisingly powerful at the state level, will be effective in figuring out ways to either get that data through contract or get that data through public policy. I'll give you one example. Many states have data ownership laws that specify that the vehicle owner owns certain data generated by their vehicle. And these vary, they're often a little too narrow for the kinds of tech data that are being produced now. But the insurance industry was real effective at getting these passed. And you might say, well, wait, why would the insurance industry want individual car owners to quote unquote own these data? And that's because then the insurers can turn around and in their insurance contract say, dear owner, you need to give us these data. So, it's just one example of how data will find a way when money is at stake.
Yeah, and you can see maybe even potential clearinghouses for data where, and even then that data could be sold to the clearinghouses and then all the insurers having access to data so that, something like that as a potential fix for getting access. Very good. I think we're going to have just one last question because we're going to cut you guys loose, and then also we're got to get on our bus to go to the Fed. Last question comes from Mike Smitka from Washington and Lee University.
Yes, I'm an economist by training, but I was delighted to hear Mike talk about the ability or the unforeseen consequences of regulation that meant that CAFE rules and emissions rules, in fact, were offset by changes from light vehicle sedans to trucks. Partly because of a GERPISA presentation last year or the year before, noting that the German luxury makers had 80 lobbyists in Brussels. I'm wondering if it's really a bit naive to think that these regulations will have the intended consequences. So certainly the industry was pleasantly surprised by the shift to pickup trucks and large SUVs, but they certainly had a very big role in seeing that the regulatory framework was an enabler for that. So now we're left with electrification, where the fleet is large vehicles that intrinsically require large batteries. In addition, with the message of range anxiety, so that you have to have a lot of range in these large vehicles, which of course in practice aren't driven very far. And so some of the same biases that came out of the CAFE rules that were footprint based is serving as a barrier to the transition to electric vehicles, because we will have a lot of underused batteries in very large vehicles. And that will come for the next few years when the supply chain is not there, maybe through 2030. That will come at the cost of intrinsically more efficient vehicles, and therefore undermine the ability of the US and Europe, for that matter, to actually achieve the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So basically comment on the political economy and the lobbying process and how that may or may not contribute to the end goal of a better environmental footprint for the industry.
John, I'm throwing that one to you first.
You're going to throw it to me, okay? First of all, thanks for the question and thanks for the performance review. I would say, the focus of the industry's engagement with policymakers is on those necessary conditions I talked about earlier, right? It is on the development of infrastructure. It's on the development of supply chains. It's on retooling of the industrial base, and it's on providing consumers with access and affordability, things like incentives and tax credits. That's the bulk of our focus. Our engagements with the regulators, Mike can correct my perspective on this if he chooses, is to support a regulatory pathway that encourages electrification. So for example, both with regard to carbon, I'm speaking only in the US, I can't respond to the number of lobbyists in Germany, can't do it. But here in the United States, what we've been working, for example, with EPA on is to ensure that the standards, as stringent as they are, also create tools in the regulatory toolbox to encourage electrification. So credits and multipliers, for example, we've done the same thing with carbon. So that's been our approach. The regulator and has to speak for him or herself with regard to how they balance reduced emissions with consumer choice. And I think Mike spoke to that earlier, but I'll get out of the way and allow him to speak to it again.
So I think, I won't touch on the lobbying part. I won't touch on the lobbying part of things. That's out of my purview. But certainly everything that the commenter just said about just recognizing about vehicle size, energy consumption, battery sizes, and cost. These are all things that we're very keenly aware of, and trying to figure out exactly, like, are we able to sort of rebalance? Should we be rebalancing things towards different direction? As of course, the big issue is cost, right? I mean, one of two big issues: cost. If all of the vehicles are large and have large batteries, they're going to cost a lot of money, and that's going to exclude a lot of people from purchasing new vehicles. And then, of course, if we end up with a fleet that's and I hate to pick on GM, but if they're all Hummers, then those Hummers also consume a lot of electricity, and there are emissions associated with those, right? So I don't think we will have succeeded in reaching our environmental goals if our regs are structured such that every American is driving an electrified Hummer. So. So we do have knobs we can turn here. I just don't know, which ones we will turn, and if the administrator will decide to turn any, and maybe potentially rebalance some of those behaviors.
Thank you, Mike. Brian, you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Just my luck. I take a foray into economics, and then the next question is from an economist. I will say, with respect to AVs and to a lesser extent with EVs, given how much this is already an established industry, there's a real dilemma that I think we face at a policy level. And that is, how much do we embrace a new technology because it offers to solve at least some of our problems, and really prioritize that new technology? And how much do we use that new technology as an opportunity to change the way that we do things? Because the technology is new, there's less potential political capture, there's less potential vested economic interests, the public doesn't have set expectations, and so we're able to make decisions and changes that we could not do with, say, conventional gasoline vehicles, or with conventional human-driven, individually owned vehicles. It just would not be politically feasible, but it might be for these new technologies. But doing so would mean disadvantaging those new technologies vis-a-vis their anachronistic competitors. And that's a really tough balance. How much do we just say we're going to push the new technology, and how much do we say this is a chance to do things more broadly, differently, and better, even if it means that the new technologies are going to cost more, are going to take longer, and are going to reach people slower? I don't have an answer for that.
Okay, final question. John, I'll start with you. When I had Mike Jackson from OESA speak at my conference in April, I asked him if the government could do one thing right now for suppliers. He said CHIPS Act. John, for manufacturers, what would it be?
Yeah, look, I think it's a stable entry, 1A. I do agree with Mike that the CHIPS Act is critically important. In this space, expanding and extending EV tax credits to support consumers in the shift to electrification would be a priority.
Very good, thank you. Mike, I'm not going to ask you what the government should do. I'm going to ask you what you would like to see the manufacturers do. Just one, if they could do just one, if you get them to do just one thing, what would it be?
Agree to account for real world energy consumption in the compliance as a compliance mechanism.
Very good. Yeah, very good. Brian?
There's a new one for you, John.
Manufacturers to do one thing, what would it be?
Raise,
I'm sorry, let's go back to government with you, Brian. If you could get the government to do one thing, what would it be?
raise expectations for all the old things, conventional vehicles, human drivers, and our boring old infrastructure. By raising the bar for that will actually improve the chances for new technologies to take hold.
Very good. I want to thank all of you for your insights about the topics that we're doing. Excellent discussion. We could go on. I know we could go on, but within the period of time, I think we touched a lot of bases. John, Mike, and Brian, thanks very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Welcome, Bruce. Thanks.
Excellent question.
Thank you all. Yes, awesome audience. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.